I'm Father Ryan Humphries. The letter to Philemon, or if you took a course from an extremely pretentious scriptural theologian, Philemon. I won't say his name out loud in case he's watching, but that never happened to me, clearly. So we're talking about 25 verses, right? Not even chapter divisions in this book. Incredibly short, incredibly small. One of those things that makes you kind of wonder, why would this be included in the Bible at all? It's so very, very little to say. It's written by Paul to a very wealthy landowner named Philemon as a kind of letter of recommendation, what we would think of as kind of like a letter of introduction from, say, the Middle Ages. And it's written on behalf of a slave named Onesimus who has run away, who has been arrested, who Paul met in prison. The slave has been incredibly supportive of Paul while he's in prison. Paul has shared the gospel with this slave, and now the slave is converted, and Paul is telling him, you should go back to your master because this is what the Lord wants you to do. And so Paul is writing this letter to accompany Onesimus to his master Philemon, and he's basically as a favor. And he says, Dear Philemon, Onesimus ran away. He and I spent time together in jail. He's returning to you at my instruction. Please receive him back without punishment. Truly, Paul. I mean, that really is what the whole letter boils down to. 25 verses, but it causes a whole hornet's nest of drama. Well, the first question is, why does everybody get themselves worked up about it? Well, first, because Paul is not demanding an end to slavery. This is only in the last maybe 150 years we're getting worked up about it, but we're getting worked up about it, and people don't like the letter to Philemon for exactly that reason. Also, people are nervous and confused because why isn't Paul asking for Philemon to release Onesimus? Not slavery in the universe, but just this guy who clearly is a good guy. He's got human dignity. He should not be a slave. And in fact, Paul does kind of suggest that in a roundabout way. He talks about how Onesimus is a Christian. But in a very short letter, we're presented with a fairly complex and difficult moral question, which Paul addresses in an indirect sort of way. We do get a bit here about the dignity of Christians, of what it means to be a Christian, and we do get a bit about how Christians should show preferential love one to the other. Now, that makes modern people, maybe in the last 40 years, upset. That's a very, very new kind of thing for them to gripe about. But we get a solid reminder that the body of Christ has Jesus at its head. And so that really is kind of the essential thing we draw from the letter to Philemon before the kind of modern whining about slavery and about preferential, the Christians should be preferential toward one another. Now, we could ask, as I said, why this is included in the Bible, and my guess, and the guess of most modern theologians, is because Paul wrote it, right? We just only have so many things that Paul wrote, and everything that we are sure Paul wrote gets included in the Bible. That's just kind of a part of it. But it's one of these kind of, odd books that for a very, very small letter causes a lot of drama. Now, there are two obvious questions that we want to address, and I've mentioned both of them, but let me just kind of address them and give the modern Christian answer for these kind of modern Christian questions. Now, first, Paul recommends that Christians should show favoritism to other Christians. And the modern person asks, well, isn't that opposed to something? We're not sure. Well, because modern people are opposed to everything, they assume there should be something that Christians should not show favoritism to other Christians for reasons. And it's a question that only arises in the very, very modern, I won't use the word woke, but we could say, the kind of post-2000 millennial sort of idea where anyone who shows preference for anything except what's politically correct is somehow a bad person. But I have some very difficult pills for those kind of folks to swallow. The first is that God does not will diversity of thought or religion. There is nothing in our Bible at any point that says God likes for us to think differently or that he wants us to surround ourselves with people who worship differently. Quite the opposite. There is no virtue in being simply diverse for diversity's sake when it comes to thought or when it comes to worship. On top of that, we have to remember that in John chapter 17, Jesus prays that they may all be one. Not that they may all live in the same place, but that they may all be one. And it is not bigotry, I mean by a genuine psychological understanding, to prefer to share one's life with people who share your values, your priorities, your beliefs about eternity, your worldview, and your religious beliefs. I mean, it's clear elsewhere, but St. Paul is quite fairly recommending that Christians surround themselves with other Christians, not as a bubble, but just because why would you invite conflict just for its own sake? Even Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung acknowledge that there's no value in that. And contrary to the dogmatism of kind of modern media, diversity in and of itself is not necessarily a good thing. It might be useful, it might be helpful, but it can also lead to a generation that has no sense of self-identity, no sense of integrity, and no larger historical context. I mean, just the idea that we should be different for the sake of difference is a psychological disorder. It shows a hatred of self, and it's not something that we would consider to be good or healthy in any context of a psychological or a spiritual understanding of humanity. Even today, the church teaches it's better for us to marry someone of the same religious faith, the same cultural background even, and that it's better for churches to be established in local communities rather than as a conglomeration of different cultural groups. Famously, New Orleans, if anyone's been there, and it happens in other cities too, Chicago, Philly, Boston, you go and you might see 3 Catholic churches within a block. And that's because that was where the Poles went, that's where the Irish went, and that's where the Italians went. And it was not something that was a problem. It was just that these are communities that mostly immigrant kind of communities, and they wanted to be together. They shared food preferences, cultural preferences, worldviews. And while it's not necessarily fundamentally good to exclude others, neither is it fundamentally good to include them just to include them. That's not something that we can argue is psychologically or spiritually healthy as an end in and of itself. In fact, in the age of Christendom, the High Middle Ages, the cultural divisions in Europe were understood to be far less important because everyone shared the same religious beliefs. And so it was not as big a deal if you were a Frank as opposed to a Saxon, as opposed to a German, as it is nowadays, because there was the unifying factor of faith. And so there's a lot to be said for Paul saying that Christians should prefer or show preference for other Christians. It may be contrary to the dogmatism of the day, but there's no meaningful way to argue other than this is what we were told when I went to Berkeley and studied sociology. There's no meaningful argument other than this is what modern people say. The other natural question that arises is why Paul doesn't call for an end to slavery as an institution. And we need to look at 3 things to provide some context for this. And I appreciate this is not necessarily essential to the study of the letter that we're reading, but it is essential to understanding why Philemon is such a big deal in some people's minds. So 3 kind of big issues. First of all, think about the history of monarchy. Since the 18th century, monarchy has been out of fashion. But for the previous 5,000 years of human history, it was the norm. And the underlying premise of monarchy is one of 2 things. Either God established the king and his family, so they're backed by what we call divine right. These societies that buy into a divine right monarchy applied the same reasoning to slavery. If the king was the king because God said he was the king, then everyone was who they are because God allowed, at least in his permissive will, permitted it to happen. And so social mobility in those cultures was generally not possible. It generally wasn't even interesting or something that's morally right. You know, we don't see a lot of, for the example, somewhere like Shakespeare, a great deal of interest in social mobility. We see a very, very small handful of nods this way and that, but almost always they're told about in a mocking way. It's not until we get way forward, until we see something like the era of Jane Austen, that we start to see this idea of social mobility as something we really desire. And you get a little bit of it in the Roman Empire, but broadly speaking, societies that had divine right monarchy did not buy into a loose social hierarchical system. And so if you were a slave, you were a slave for reasons. They may be secular reasons, they may be spiritual reasons, but the whole worldview of that society was built around this sense of a strict social hierarchy. And so the idea for those people of dissolving slavery simply didn't enter into their minds. It wasn't something that they even began to consider. And that same sort of thing applies to Paul, who's in a society that is strictly socially hierarchical. The other part of the monarchy, the other side of the monarchy, is the power monarchy, where the king is the king because he's the best man for the job. He's the philosopher king if you're Plato. He's the warlord if you're somebody else. Maybe he's the best warrior. Maybe he's the smartest politician, whatever. But he's the king because he earned it or gained it through something. And in that case, slaves are slaves because they deserve to be at the bottom of the list because they lost or they did not succeed or whatever. They're poor businessmen. They were dumb, whatever. And again, that's going to change from place to place as Christianity spreads. And even in the letter to Philemon, Paul is arguing that shouldn't be a compelling reason for people to be enslaved. But Plato's idea of the philosopher king actively argues in favor of slavery because the wise have a moral obligation to govern the weak. And so both of these, contrary to our modern thinking, but both of them were essential aspects of the culture at the time of Paul. So one of the reasons Paul is not arguing to dissolve slavery as an institution is there is nobody in any direction that even remotely sees slavery as a problem in the way that we see it as a problem. In fact, we kind of have to kind of switch our minds. And the second thing I want to think about after monarchy is throughout the ancient world, indentured servitude, slavery, and these social hierarchies were ubiquitous. And so the way I want us to think is the way that modern people think about pet owners, right? Modern day people, we say, oh, you have a pet. And we try not to judge based on how weird that pet is. Oh, you have a pet tarantula. You're not a weirdo. Delightful. Good. Oh, you have a pet ferret or a pet anaconda or a sugar glider, which my mother bought for me for no reason I can explain, which is a small flying squirrel. You know, we have these weird pets. And we're considered good pet owners if we treat our pets well. And we don't generally see many people calling for an end to the institution of pet owning. You have a handful of weirdos, but you don't generally see that as long as the pet owner is good. Now, if the pet owner is bad, every single one of us wants that person arrested and beat with a pool noodle in the middle of the street because they're a terrible, terrible person. That's comical for us. But in the ancient world, with this ubiquity of social hierarchy, you were a good person if you treated those people that you had direct ownership of well. And so if I'm a slave owner in the ancient world, I'm a good slave owner if I feed my slaves, I don't work them too hard, I treat them with respect, maybe I give them, some benefits and some freedoms or whatever. That's what it meant to be a good slave owner. A bad slave owner was basically like a bad pet owner, and they were treated poorly by their peers just as bad pet owners are treated poorly by our peers now. But again, this kind of sets a little bit in mind of where Paul's mind was. This was just culturally the norm. And there weren't as many bad slave owners as we generally think of. We have, of course, the Romans with the Colosseum, but we don't have, the kind of ubiquitous idea where everybody who owned slaves beat them at night for funsies. It was certainly not a happy life to be a slave, but we do have to kind of keep in mind that slavery as an institution was once to make the equivalent money you would need to buy a house. That seems completely bizarre to us, but indentured servitude was a regular need to kind of just get off Paul's back. Expected that Jesus was coming back soon, that we should expect to see Jesus quite literally at any moment, next week, next month, but soon. And in fact, he is not telling people, hey, as Christians, you need to get out there and have a 5-year plan. He's not telling people as Christians, you need to get involved in an investment portfolio. He's saying, look, you have to earn money to eat. great. But Jesus is coming back soon, so don't worry too hard about worldly accomplishment. He's not looking to change societal norms. He's not looking to fix cultural problems. He expects the Lord to come back lickety-split. We, through the lens of hindsight, have the idea that for whatever reason, the Lord is not coming back next week. He could, but we should be good Christian business owners. We should be good Christian investors. We should think about our lives through the lens of Christianity. Paul didn't have any of that. Paul was expecting that things would end soon, and there's no point in trying to fix these great institutional errors if Jesus is coming back next week and they're just going to cease to exist. And so that's probably the most important thing to keep at the back of our minds. But I did want to give you some of the broader context as to why the church did not immediately jump on the end of slavery, in the 200s, the 300s, the 400s, or whatever. And so Philemon is a very, very short and simple letter that has a couple of mines, of landmines right in the middle of it that get people very, very worked up. And so as you're reading, you'll ask those questions, and that's completely okay. But I did want to give you this kind of context because there's not another good place to put it, but it is something that's kind of in the back of a lot of our minds as we go. And this also, I believe, brings an end to the letters of St. Paul. Next time we are jumping into one of my favorite books of the entire Bible, the letter to the Hebrews, that was not written by St. Paul. And so we want to thank Paul for his wonderful writing. He has been a hoot, but we are done with him, and now we're moving on to the anonymous author of the letter to the Hebrews, and we'll get to that next time. I've been Father Ryan Humphries. This is the CU Catecast, and I hope you have a good one.